last week we were dealing with more arguments, more conflict with the leaders of the temple, and so we stopped at the end of that after the after the incident of the widow with the two leptons, two mites, widow's mites. And we pick it up as they're leaving the temple. Now remember, as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are there. I talked to you sometime back, I know when, but I'm going to repeat some things, about just how impressive the temple was. The temple enclosure, not the building itself, but the whole enclosure, was 36 acres. That's more than enough for a good vineyard if it's in the right place. 36 acres is a lot of ground. And when there's this specific reference to stone, according to Josephus, the largest stones were 50 feet long, 24 feet broad, and 16 feet thick. Some of these have been found. This is true. And Josephus was usually pretty good. He was not an engineer, but he was usually pretty good on observations. Most of the stones, those are the biggies, were 37.5 feet by 12 by 18. These larger stones would weigh 200 tons or more. That's serious engineering. That's serious building. It's no wonder that one of the disciples is impressed. The other thing that was so impressive about the temple was just how rich it was, just how much of it was covered in gold, just how much of it, just how much ornamentation there was, just how much jewelry there was. It was an extraordinary treasure. And that's interesting. The disciples have just had a lesson about not evaluating things by their earthly value. The widow with the two mites. And yet, they're still really impressed by things that cost a lot. As well they might be. And Jesus answering said unto him, Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, this is a very important, I know this sounds simple, but actually it's very, very complex, or at least there are layers upon layers here. Actually, I'm going to read you a little more of the chapter, and then we'll come back to it bit by bit. Shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, it's across the valley. Mm-hmm. It's close. Peter and James and John and Andrew. Now that's a change. Usually if there's something going on privately with just three disciples, with just a handful, it's Peter, James, and John. Somehow Andrew's along here too. And remember, Andrew is Peter's brother. Yeah. So this is two sets of brothers. I don't know if that means anything or not, but it is. And Andrew asked him privately, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? Including the destruction of the temple. And Jesus answering them began to say, Take heed lest any man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And when you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, be ye not troubled, for such things must needs be, but the end shall not be yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be earthquakes in divers places, and there shall be famines and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows. But take heed to yourselves, for they shall deliver you up to councils, and in the synagogues you shall be beaten, and you shall be brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them. And the gospel must first be published among all nations. But when they shall lead you and deliver you up, take no thought beforehand what you shall speak, neither do ye premeditate, but whatsoever shall be given you in that hour, that speak ye. For it is not ye that speak, but the Holy Ghost. Now the brother shall betray the brother to death, and the father the son, and children shall rise up against their parents, and shall cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. But he that shall endure until the end, the same shall be saved. But when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, notice how often Daniel, references to Daniel appear in Mark, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him that is on the housetop not go down into the house, neither enter therein to take anything out of his house. There were generally outdoor stairways up to the top of these flat roofs. It's like an extra room up there. And let him that is in the field not turn back again for to take up his garment. But woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, and pray ye that your flight be not in the winter. For in those days shall be affliction, such as was not from the beginning of the creation which God created unto this time, neither shall be. And except the Lord hath shortened those days, no flesh could be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he hath chosen, he hath shortened the days. And if any man shall say to you, Lo, here is Christ, or Lo, he is there, believe him not. For false Christ and false prophets shall rise, and shall show signs and wonders, to seduce, if it were possible, even the elect. But take ye heed, behold, I have foretold you all things. I'm going to stop there, even though this is probably the longest speech of Jesus in any of the Gospels, with the exception of St. John's farewell discourse at the Last Supper. But I had to read a good bit of it because I'm going to be trying to put it together for you. Thank you. Okay, there's a reference to Daniel in here. The reference is to Daniel 9, in which Daniel predicts this. Don't worry about the time thing here. We don't quite know what that means. He's talking about, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Now this is very difficult to understand. And some of it, quite frankly, scholars, there's so many fractured ideas about it. But here are some things that we know that really do matter.
Randolph, what portion of Daniel is that again?
Daniel 9, verse 26, beginning. Firstly, to deal with some of the words here. He shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. In other words, he's going to stop. He being the prince of the world, all right, the people of the prince that shall come to destroy the city. Shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. notice it says the sacrifice, not the sacrifices. That's because it is referring to a specific thing, the Tamid sacrifice.
The what?
The Tamid, T-A-M-I-D. Now, this is the Tamid sacrifice. It is recorded in Exodus that this is what God told Moses should be done in the tabernacle, in the tent of meeting, rather, and, which was going to be the precursor to the temple, and it was carried on the temple. And what it says is, this is what thou shalt offer upon the altar, 2 lambs of the first year, notice the lamb's not yet a year old, day by day, continually. Tamid means continual or eternal. It means this has got to be done every day, forever. The 1 lamb thou shalt offer in the morning, the other lamb thou shalt offer at even. And it talks about what should go with the lamb, flour and wine and oil. Okay? This shall be a continual, a perpetual, a forever burnt offering throughout your generations at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord, which of course became before the door of the temple, which is where the altar was. But here's the thing. The way this was done, early in the morning, 9 o'clock, and we've got a number of references to this, okay? Partly from the Babylonian Talmud, partly from Josephus. Yay, Josephus. The first lamb was the first thing to be offered on the on every day. And the altar was very large, stone. The fire was built in the altar, possibly with wood, possibly with charcoal, I'm not sure. I think of it as wood, pretty sure it was wood. Anyhow, and then this lamb was offered and laid upon the fire. As soon as that was done, then you could begin all the other sacrifices that people wanted doing. Okay, sacrifice this lamb so that my granddaughter can get into Swarthmore, that sort of thing. And that continued until 4 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, the second lamb was sacrificed. The first lamb was never removed. Whatever was left of it, and the bones were probably, the bones wouldn't over enough, was still there. Other sacrifices were laid on top of it. And then at the end, it was gradually burned down, the second lamb was laid on top. So the Tamid sacrifice was sort of the beginning and the end of sacrifices. It means all the sacrifices of the day, right? By stopping when the prince of the people that shall come and destroy the city would cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. That meant ending or preventing, at least, temple sacrifice, which was really pretty powerful stuff. And for the overspreading of abominations. An abomination, most commonly in the Old Testament, abomination and desolation are 2 words that almost always go together. An abomination is something of a religious nature, particularly the offering to foreign deities, to other gods. That was such an offense to God, a total offense. What Daniel is talking about here, what he's predicting here, is what indeed happened in the reign of Antiochus II, Antiochus Epiphanes. I've told you about Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the Syrian king who attempted to have himself recognized as a god, That's what Epiphanes, he gave himself that name, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the God revealed. And, well, here's what Josephus says about what Antiochus did in Jerusalem. Oops, sorry, that's not right. Okay, well, here. This is from the year 167 BC, this happened. Antiochus got possession of the city by treachery. He had been besieging it, and a bunch of people said, yeah, we'll let you in. We're your buddies, and you're our buddy, right? So they, at which time he spared not so much as those that admitted him into it. He didn't even spare the ones who betrayed the city, on account of the riches that lay in the temple, but led by his covetous inclination, for he saw there was a great deal of gold and many ornaments that had been dedicated to it of very great value. And in order to plunder its wealth, he ventured to break the agreement he had made. So he left the temple bare and took away the golden candlesticks and the golden altar and table and the altar, and did not abstain even from the veils, which were made of fine linen and scarlet. He also emptied it of its secret treasures and left nothing at all remaining. And by this means cast the Jews into great lamentation, for he forbade them to offer those daily sacrifices, and Josephus uses the word tamid, which they used to offer to God according to the law. And when the king had built an idol altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice, neither according to the law nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. He also compelled them to forsake the worship which they paid their own God, and to adore those whom he took to be gods, and made them build temples and raise altars in every city and village, and offer swine upon them every day. Okay? Hence, oops. Sorry, I missed the phrase. Anyhow.
That's what got the Maccabees.
Yes.
Yes, from Daniel. The overspreading of abominations, he forced them to build temples to sacrifice, to sacrifice swine upon. This is, wow, it all happened, okay? And we know that. That's well attested to. But here's an interesting thing. That happened a long time ago. Jesus talked about it in future tense. This is going to happen. And it did.
No.
And it did.
Sorry, when did it happen?
It
in
happened.
70 AD?
Yes.
Okay.
In 70 AD.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to really get off here. There was an uprising. There was an uprising. It started in Caesarea Maritima, and it spread throughout the country, including to Jerusalem. And this was an uprising against the Romans. And the Romans decided they weren't going to put up with that. Nero was the emperor at that point. And he sent an elderly man, interesting guy, elderly guy named Vespasian, as to command the legions to put down this rebellion. Well, while Vespasian was fighting away with considerable success, Nero was overthrown and committed suicide. And this began what was known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Literally, there were 4 different emperors within the space of a year. It was chaos. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Nothing was going. Nobody knew who was going. How would the empire split? Half would it split into more than half? Who knows? But 4 emperors in a row. While this was going on, Vespasian, having reduced one of the 2 great fortresses of Israel, had now begun to besiege the other, which was Masada. And Vespasian knew that his his command would only last until the war was over, at which point he would have to give up the legion. If you were a successful legionary commander, it was not really safe not to be ambitious to be emperor, because the others who were would realize you were emperor material and they'd off you. So Vespasian slowed down operations. And he was indeed proclaimed emperor by his troops. A couple of other provinces came in with him, including Egypt, which was very important. And he set off. Actually, he had other people do it for him. Most of the fighting was done by others. Those who had declared for him finished off the year of the four emperors by finishing off the fourth emperor after a series of battles, which is, I'm not going to bore you with. But Vespasian then becomes emperor. And he was very successful. He's one of my favorites. He leaves his son Titus in charge of the operations at Masada, which are concluded successfully. And then he besieges Jerusalem. And besieges Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, the siege of Jerusalem is recounted in great detail by Josephus, and it's heartbreaking, really, in many ways. There are 3 or 4 different Jewish communities, bunches of people inside Jerusalem, and they're fighting each other more than they're fighting the Romans. The Romans didn't have a big enough army to completely surround the city, but they blocked off some parts of it, denuded the countryside of wood, and just basically sit back and for quite a while and let the people inside destroy one another. And by the way, one of those groups was the what are they called?
The Zealots, the Maccabees?
Zealots?
The Essenes, yeah. One of their leaders was, they were a group of Essenes. They don't think of them as Benedictine monks. These people were warriors too. Anyhow, Josephus tells us in great detail about the siege and what happened at the end of the siege. What happened at the end of the siege is that the temple was burned. Now, Josephus says that was not Titus's intention, but it did happen. The temple was burned. Titus set up the Roman legionary emblems inside the east wall of the temple and sacrificed inside it. It's a replay. It happened again. Sorry, I get very engaged with this issue. Anyhow, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign?" And Jesus answering began to say, "Take heed lest any man deceive you." The very first part of his reply is, that's an interesting question, or but don't be deceived. It's a warning against being deceived. Their desire to know that which they are incapable of knowing makes them susceptible to deceit. Think about that. Now, we don't always know what we can and can't know. But if you are desperate to know something that you cannot know by legitimate means, it makes you very liable, very susceptible to being deceived by those who will tell you what they think you want to hear. There was a For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Yeah, they did. There were lots of them. And indeed, there were a couple of them inside Jerusalem during the siege, or so it appears. Josephus says there was a false prophet who'd made a public proclamation in the city that very day, the day of the assault, that God commanded them to get upon the temple, go up, and that they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. Now there was then a great number of false prophets, suborned by the tyrants to impose on the people. By the tyrants, he means the leaders of the various Jewish groups within the city. Suborned by the tyrants to impose on the people, who announced to them that they should wait for deliverance from God, and this was in order to keep them from deserting. And, whatever. Anyhow. And we do know that there were other people even after this revolt, because there were revolts for another 100 years, but they were just minor. Usually started by somebody who claimed to be the Messiah. The Messiah. And when you shall hear of wars, rumors of wars, be not troubled, for such things need be, but the end shall not be yet. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be earthquakes in divers places. There shall be famines and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows. Now wait a minute. Beginnings of sorrows? There have been plenty of sorrows. I mean, if you're Jewish and in your university, you've got a lot of sorrows to remember. It's a bad translation, I'm sorry to say. It's a very bad translation. The word is odin. And it is most commonly translated not as sorrows, but as travails. It is a specific word used in Greek for the pain of childbirth. So metaphorically, it was used to mean any difficult or painful process leading to a greatly desired outcome. And there's a reference, I'm sorry I didn't check it out. At some point, Jesus says, just as a woman in travail is, in pain and in agony because of her pain, but forgets it when the child, out of the joy when the child arrives. Yeah, that's what it means. That's the word. So when you understand that, this makes much more sense. These are the beginnings of the travail. And the idea is that at the very least, giving birth to a new age. That this is the beginning of the introduction of a new age. Something is coming that hasn't been here before. And possibly implying that there will be an increase of intensity and frequency in these calamities, like the pains of childbirth. Things are going to get bad. But take heed to yourselves, they shall deliver you full time. All these things happened, and all these things happened to the disciples. They were delivered up to councils. They were beaten in the synagogues. They were brought up before rulers and kings, as was St. Paul. And he's saying, for a testimony against them. In other words, they are convicting themselves by what they will do to you. And the gospel must first be published among all nations. Just a historical note. This one verse. As many of you know, the 18th century was an age of theism and deism, and not very much serious Orthodox Christianity of any stripe. And then the 19th century was a great revival, particularly of evangelical Christianity, but also of high church Christianity. And this particular verse, and the gospel was first to be published among all nations, was one of the major impetuses for the Victorian missionary enterprise. That if we can get the gospel preached everywhere, then Jesus will come back. But we got to do that first. And there are any number of, admittedly, almost all very minor, languages that were first translated from whatever they are, so that Bibles could be issued in those languages. One of the great missionary enterprises throughout all over, really all over, was Bible translation. And where I worked in South Africa, there was still a lot of heritage of Bishop Colenso, who had done the first translation of the Bible into Zulu. And just to, I'm constantly trying to make you aware of the difficulties of translation and how you have to be careful, unless you're reading something in the original, or even then you have to be careful. But there's a great story. Colenso was translating the crucifixion story, and he was fluent in Zulu. He worked as a missionary among them for a while. And he came to the part where it says that they lifted up a sponge to Jesus' lips with the sour wine. And he didn't know the Zulu word for sponge. So he asked one of his Zulu acquaintances, and he didn't know the word for sponge either. He said, I don't know, what's a sponge? And he said, well, it's what you wash yourself with. And the guy said, oh, yeah, I know what you mean. He told him the word, right? Well, Zulu didn't have a word for sponge for the simple reason that they weren't a seafaring people. They didn't have much to do with the sea. And the way they cleaned themselves was by rubbing themselves with rocks. Rough rocks. So, like, what do you call them?
Hummus.
Yeah. So while we were over there, the Zulu Bible was being translated into English again, for only the second time. Up to that point, I'm sure there had been hundreds and thousands of Zulu speakers who were puzzled by how the heck they got that stone on a stick. Yeah. So, yeah. The Victorian missionary impulse was really an important part of the history of the spread of Christianity. Anyhow, but when they shall lead you, deliver you up. This is about taking no thought beforehand, because the Holy Ghost will tell you what to speak. I really don't know much what to make of that. I really don't. I guess it's pretty straightforward, but honestly, it didn't resonate with me the way a lot of the other parts of this did. In particular, the next part. Now the brother shall betray the brother to death, and the father the son, and children shall rise up against their parents and shall cause them to be put to death. It happened. Families were torn apart, and for the next 3 centuries, families in the Roman Empire were torn apart by the preaching of the gospel. If any of you want and think you can stand it, it's not long to read, but boy, it's heartbreaking. There is a 3rd century document, very well known, called The Passion of Saints Perpetua and Felicity.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so you're aware of that. Perpetua and Felicity were 2 young women who lived in Carthage in the very, very late 2nd, early 3rd century. And in the year 202 or 203, there was a local persecution. It was not a empire-wide persecution, local persecution of Christians. And Vivia Perpetua, who was all of 22 years old, with a newborn child, still nursing, was a Christian. And her father, who was well off, told her, you better give up that nonsense, because they're cracking down on the Christians, and it's going to be bad. Well, she may have been 22, but she acted like a teenager. I didn't mean that. She immediately got baptized. So now she really is a Christian. And it's a great dialogue. Now, this portion There's an introductory portion, which is written in good, solid Latin. Then there's a second portion, which she wrote herself, and it's very colloquial. It's a very different tone. This is her diary from the time she's been in prison. And in a great thing, she says to her father, "That little pot there, what is it?" He says, "It's a pot." And she says, "Well, can I call it something else?" And he said, "No, because you got to call it a pot. That's what it is." And she said, "Well, I'm a Christian, and that's what I've got to call myself."
Mm-hmm.
So she refused to disavow Christ. She and Felicity, who was her maid, also a young woman, pregnant, were put in prison, and they tried to dissuade them. Her father visited her 3 times in prison. Her brother visited her once. They fled with her. This is what was going on. And in the end, I'm simplifying for the sake, because it's not really about Mark. In the end, she was martyred. And then that part of the text is written again in very clean academic Latin. And a lot of people think that that part was that was all, that the redactor was Tertullian, who was active at this point. Whoever it was, clearly an eyewitness to the martyr. When I went to the Severn Institute to deliver a paper, I was surprised to see that we were there in 3 days, I think, of papers. There were 4 papers delivered. This was not a church conference, folks. This was a historical conference. There were 4 different papers delivered on the martyrdom of Saints Perpetua and Felicity. It's a work of real importance to people who are interested in the Severn era. But
Can I interject here? Also, in that story, Felicity, I think, gives birth in the
she
prison.
does.
And the soldiers are mocking and laughing, at her pains, and it's very descriptive.
And she prays that she'll be able to be delivered of child, because if she isn't, she won't be able to be martyred. I mean, there's a lot of detail in this thing. It's a look into a very dark side of the Roman psyche.
And the prisons were horrible. I mean, they were just like
They were just
mud
holes.
holes with bars on them. They were just unbelievably awful.
Yep. Those of us who've been to the Tullianum in Rome know it's just a hole in the ground. Really, that was it. Okay. I've given them thy word, and the world hath hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. I pray not that thou shouldst take them out of the world, but that thou shouldst keep them from the evil. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. This, in a way, flashes back, as far as I'm concerned, flashes back to render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and under God what is God's. We are in the world. We are part of the world. But it's not where we really belong. It's not what we were really created for.
Excuse me, sir. What verses were you reading there just then?
I'm sorry. That's from St. John's Gospel.
Oh, St. John. No wonder I couldn't find it.
John 17. John 17. No, the next verse in Mark here is, when you shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, this has another very interesting thing. In the Greek, the word abomination, and as I said to you, that was a term that was used particularly of anything that deeply offended God, and specifically desecration of the temple by sacrifices other than to God himself. it's a feminine word in Greek. But here, when you shall see the abomination spoken by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not. No, the word in Greek is he, standing where he ought not. And a lot of commentators believe that that's not a grammatical mistake. Well, it is a grammatical mistake, but that it's a grammatical irregularity introduced to make the point that Titus himself was the abomination. Okay. I don't know if I believe that or not, but I thought I'd let you know. Desolation, again, is a technical term here. And it means all of the ills that befall when a place or a people or a person is deserted by God. That's what it means. That this is when God has turned his back. And the abomination is cause enough for him to do that. The term is used quite a few times in Kings and maybe in Samuel too, I'm not sure, where they talk about the various Jewish kings who did naughty things, and particularly did naughty things in the temple or allowed the worship of foreign gods. That's what it goes back that far. This abomination and desolation, or in this case, the abomination of desolation. By the way, I've talked about the books of Maccabees. I've mentioned Maccabees. The two books of Maccabees are the story of the Jewish revolt told from the Jewish side. And that also, it begins in the very first chapter of First Maccabees. Now the 15th day of the month Caslu in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. That's Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains, and then he goes on about get the heck out, right? This is clearly not what a lot of people want to make it, and particularly a lot of sectarians of various types. It is not a prophecy of the end of times. Because if it were, it wouldn't do you any good to go to the mountains or anywhere else. There is no escape at the end of times. This is a prophecy that is fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And this is not the end of days. There's no way you can get away from the end of days. This is something different. A lot of purple here. False Christ and false prophets shall rise and shall show signs and wonders to seduce, if it were possible, even the elect. Mother John preaches about this a lot, and I'm actually might have something to say about it on Sunday at 9 o'clock myself. But I don't want to beat it to death, but it is a constant in the Old Testament and the New Testament that there are warnings against false prophets, false teachers. And sometimes these are people who are simply deluding, but often they're charlatans. And particularly in the Old Testament, there's some outright accusations that many of the court prophets, as they were told, were simply guys who would say, ask the king what did he want to hear, and make sure that they told him that. Yeah, God says you're right, king, and they lived well off of that. It almost seems sometimes that one of the truest marks of a prophet is that nobody listens to him, or at least not in his own lifetime, or her own lifetime. But in those days, after that tribulation, The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the heaven shall fall. This is the prophecy of the end times. And notice he says after, but he didn't say immediately after. And given how much Mark loves the word immediately, I think that's significant. We don't know how long it's going to be. And then they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power, great power. And glory. Where have we heard that before?
Daniel.
Daniel 7. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven. All right? And then he shall send his angels, and shall gather his elect from the four winds, from the uttermost parts of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. I think I've talked about this before. It doesn't need explication here, but just a reminder, because it might come in handy later. The number 4 in ancient numerology meant the whole earth, the earth. And not only were there not only were there 4 cardinal directions, but there were 4 humors, there were 4 elements, there were 4 winds. In fact, one of the early church fathers, and I can't remember which one, makes the argument that, well, of course there are only 4 gospels. That's all you need. 4 means everything. He literally writes about that, and he mentions the idea of the 4 winds. Wind being, of course, in Greek, spirit, also spirit and breath. Now learn a parable from the fig tree.
Here we go back to the
When
fig tree.
Yeah, we're back to fig trees again. So, yeah, you'll see these things come, though that it is not, even that the door is verily, I say unto you, this generation shall not cast off all these things be done.
Father Bragg, I'm sorry. Is that one of those examples of this generation that's referring to humanity?
Yes, this age, we might say. Now, I must give you an alternate reading here, because there is an alternate idea, and I don't agree with it, but there are plenty who do, so you need to hear it. I said this is the end times. Jesus coming in the clouds of power and great glory. Some Christians believe not. Some believe that what is being predicted here is the ascension and the coming of the Holy Spirit to empower the church, and that it will be the church that is to gather together the elect from the 4 winds. This, again, was an idea that was much favored by a lot of the Victorian mission-minded types, the Victorian evangelicals. It's possible. You can read it either way. It's not a salvation matter. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, neither the Son, but the Father. Now, this is just a little side thing, but it's worth remembering. Jesus, in his lifetime, was fully human. In his earthly life, was fully human. And Scripture explicitly tells us that he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself out and took the form of a servant and was obedient unto death, even death on the cross. Jesus was not omniscient. Jesus didn't know that the Aztecs were doing whatever they were doing, part of being human is the uncertainty of not knowing a lot of things we wish we knew and not knowing the future. And here we are sort of closing out almost that discussion about, hey, Jesus, tell us when all this is going to come to pass. He says, I don't know. Nobody knows. And then he tells them, but be careful, take heed, watch and pray, because you don't know when the test is. For the Son of Man is as a man taking a far journey, who left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to every man his work, and commanded the quartered way. What does this remind you of?
The parable of the vineyard.
Exactly. And in the parable of the vineyard, it's God who is the God of Israel, who goes away for a while,
Yes.
and then will come back. This is artful. Watch ye therefore, for you know not when the master of the house cometh, at even, or at midnight, or at the cock crowing, or in the morning. I just got to tell you this. One of the things that points that I tried to make when I was talking about the influence of the Romans, and also about the influence of the Romans, is that one of the most influential aspects of the Roman Empire was the military. Not just because they fought and won wars, but because they did all kinds of other stuff. They were engineers. They were the public engineers. They kept order in some places. They did all kinds of things. So everybody, well, not everybody, but a very large number of people would have been very familiar with the Roman military, how they did things. And the way the Romans, what made the Romans so powerful militarily? Well, there were a couple of things, but one was they were incredibly organized. They were much like a modern military in a lot of ways. They were very organized. There was standard operating procedure for almost everything. And one of the things was setting the night watch. For the Romans, the day was divided into 12 hours. All right? And yes, they had good timepieces. Not like watches, but they had sundials, which they knew how to use. If you know how to use them right, they can be pretty good for you. And they even knew about you having to adjust them for the time of the year. They also had something called a clepsydestra. There were two different types. They were water clocks, and they could measure when you didn't have any sun, you had to have something to measure. The clepsydestra measured time by the dripping of water. There were a couple of different basic designs for clepsydestra, but they all worked on the same principle. Well, you don't have hours at night, not in Roman timekeeping. You have watches from the military. Okay? Watch ye therefore, you know not when the master of the house cometh, at even, or at midnight, or at the cock crowing, or in the morning. That can be really sort of confusing, because you think, wait, doesn't the cock crow in the morning? Isn't that when the rooster wakes everybody up? Aha, here are the 4 night watches of the Romans. The evening watch, from sundown until 9 p.m. The midnight watch, at even or at midnight, from 9 p.m. to midnight, and the Gallicinium, the cockcrow watch, which begins at midnight and ends when the cock crows. And then the dawn watch from 3 a.m. until dawn. I misspoke. It's not until the cock crows. There was a trumpet call that would signal the end of each watch, and the one at 3 a.m. was known as the cock crow. So that's why the third watch is called the Gallicinium. Gallicinium. Gallus is rooster, and Gallus is rooster. And watch, and what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch.
Father, could I ask a question? On verse 28, now learn apparently the fig tree and the branch is yet tender, and she put it forth the evening of the sun here. Evangelicals who are very into the last days and predicting things use that budding of the fig tree because the fig tree is often an image of Israel, Israel becoming a nation as a sign. And I don't. Do you have any comments on that?
Oh, I have lots of comments on that. Firstly, you're absolutely right. They do have the evangelicals do have a great interest, many of them, in predicting the end. And they'll keep doing it no matter how many times
They do, and
history proves them wrong.
my mother, bless her heart, was one who just, that was her whole emphasis. And, you know, she, whatever politician was rising up, she always was certainly was the Antichrist. And
Well, she may have been right on that one.
How many watches did you say there were in the night? 4. So one from the evening till midnight.
No.
No.
Wait. The
The
first one is from
watch.
sundown until
So-
about 9 o'clock.
So, yeah.
And
That's called
was
the evening watch.
Evening watch was
The
sundown.
second
till-
watch is called the midnight watch, and it's from 9 to about midnight. I say about because the Romans they had time, they had ways to keep time, but they weren't atomic clocks, but they were keeping time by water, and so it
When-
might have been a little
When
bit.
was early dawn over?
About 6 a.m.
Okay.
Whenever, but it could vary slightly
yeah.
because this was a military thing. It was about making sure there was somebody keeping watch all the time, and so you would have heard that, and they were signaled by trumpet. So
Okay.
if you didn't have to have gone to war with the Romans to know about the Roman army. There was so much of it, and it wouldn't matter if you didn't have a whole 6,000 man legion. If you had 200 guys manning an outpost somewhere out on the eastern part of Judea, they'd still do this. This was part of the Roman army system. That's how you kept order. That's how you kept discipline. And that's why the Roman legions worked so well, because you could take a small part of it, hitch it onto another legion, and they all did the same stuff. They'd know. It was standardized.
What was the third watch called?
The third watch, it's called the Gallicinium.
Yeah.
Gallicinium, and I had to write
Call
that.
it cockcrow.
Cock crow or cock watch?
Cockcrow, he said that.
Pardon me?
That one was from when to when?
The Gallicinium?
Midnight.
Midnight to 3.
Midnight to 3.
Yeah.
Midnight to 3, and then the dawn watch, like the dawn patrol. Yeah, okay, never mind. 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Now, I knew that I had a feeling I was going to get through that chapter fairly quickly, relatively quickly. So I do want to go a little bit into chapter 14.
Can I ask a quick question before we leave that chapter?
Sure.
I find it interesting that when Jesus says that he doesn't know when the end days will come and reminds us he's not omniscient, he does so right after he lays out a whole lot of futuristic,
Specific stuff.
right, that most people don't know.
Exactly. That is interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. He's
And he
making
knows something about it, I
making
guess.
he knows what but not when, or that's the way it would look to me anyhow.
And it's going to be rough.
The thing that strikes me, that is so striking to me, is the book of Daniel was written regarding the Maccabean revolt and what led up to it, and Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucids, and yet it's so close to what happened with the Romans again.
And the first of those you said occurred in around 1 or 200 BC.
Yeah, it was second century. I do have the exact date here somewhere.
I think you said 167 BC or something.
That's what you say. Yeah, 167 was Antiochus getting possession of Jerusalem. Thank you, Mark. Now, I do want to talk some about chapter 14.
Could I just ask a question, and that's on the monasteries have their watches where they get up and do things. Is that on the same schedule, or is that totally different?
I have no idea. I just don't know. I know that
The Benedict.
Evensong and all those
yeah,
sorts
but
of
it's
things.
not.
Yeah,
It's
not like
on
that.
the same. No, it's not. Okay. After 2 days was feast of Passover and of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and scribes sought how they might take him by craft and put him to death. But they said, not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar of the people. Here we go again. You know, they're afraid. They're afraid of the people. The feast of the Passover, the feast of unleavened bread, 2 consecutive days, it got sort of pushed together. And it says after 2 days means this is 2 days before that. Okay? It appears that they may have originally intended, maybe, to seize Jesus during the feast. Now, remember, before he ever came to Jerusalem, they made up their minds they were going to try to get him dead. So they may have intended to seize Jesus rather, during the feast. But when they saw the popularity of Jesus at the triumphal entry and how his authority was welcomed and accepted by the people inside the temple when he was preaching, teaching, cleansing, and so forth, they may have decided that we really ought to wait until after the feast, and maybe there'll be fewer people in Jerusalem. They won't be so excited.
There won't be so many of them.
There won't be so many. There will be fewer. But here's the interesting thing. Now that's what they decided. They said, nope, not on the feast day. But they do seize him. He's cursed on Passover. Why? 2 reasons. One, Judas volunteered to sell Jesus out. So that they changed. This is an opportunity to take him at night in the garden when there's nobody around but a few of his disciples, not the big crowd. Yeah, sure. We got him. That's one reason. They lost control of convince because God was in control. They weren't. It was important that Jesus be sacrificed around the Passover. That's part of the message. That's part of the perfection of what God had begun in Israel in Christ. So even though they had a plan, but like I say, what makes God laugh the loudest, hearing us make plans. They weren't really in control. They thought they were, but they weren't. They had power, but they didn't have control. And being in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. Now, hold on, I know immediately you're thinking, whoa, you guys a leper? Well, probably a guy who had been a leper, quite possibly one of those who had been cured by Jesus, because otherwise he wouldn't have anybody in his house. He wouldn't have a house. And being in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at meat, meaning at table, there came a woman having an alabaster box of ointment of spikenard, very precious. And she brake the box and poured it on his head. Now there's some interesting things about this. Firstly, where is it? He went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. That's a bad translation. And why? Because the word for sat, the word they translated sat, is katakimeno.
It's what?
Katakimeno, which means to lie down and recline.
Yeah, well, that's what you do.
Yeah, but see, it matters because the fact that they were reclining means that this was a more or less formal dinner. This was not a casual meal. This was not, some people ain't standing up. This was not sort of, hey, Jesus dropped, oh, you're coming back, hey, take a seat. No, this was a formal arrangement. The Romans had introduced, and pretty much, and it was a mark of your civilization, the idea that if you were wealthy, because you'd have to have room for this, you had a triclinium, which was a room in which you had tables arranged, one like this, one like this, one like feels like a square seat, and the usual number was just 3, and the people would lie on couches on their right elbow like this, like this, like this, all around, and that was, that was how you ate at a formal banquet. Now, by formal, I don't mean they were all wearing tuxedos. Okay, what I mean is it was more of a serious, not entertainment. It was a more serious act of hospitality than just let's sit down and chop. All right, what else about this? So that's not a great translation.
Excuse me, Father Brad, could I ask? You mentioned Simon the leper. I suspect there were a gazillion guys named Simon.
Yep.
So you'd probably have Simon the leper or former leper, Simon the bootmaker, Simon the this, Simon the that.
That is that's common in so many societies. Yeah. And of course, it's where a lot of our family names come from.
Sure. Baker.
Carpenter. And it's not just in English. I mean, you get it in all the European languages. Not all most family names don't really come in until the medieval period. Up to that point, you were known as X, daughter of or son of Y, and or people. The family name thing is relatively late. It was very strong with the Romans, but after the end of the empire, it kind of went away. But you're right; it would be a way of Simon is such a common name. It would be a way of distinguishing him from the other Simons.
But there's actually leprosy wasn't just leprosy, it was a whole bunch of skin diseases that they clumped together. So there would be many people who were going to be recovering at some point.
I believe I had said that earlier. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment. Sorry, that's from Luke. I'm sorry. No, that's from Luke. I'll get to that in a minute. Being in Bethany's house, Simon the leper, there came a woman, says nothing about her being a sinner, having an alabaster box of ointment of spikenard, very precious, and she brake the box and poured it on its head. Man, it is hard for us to understand just how sensational this is, unless you know a little bit about the customs. First off, spikenard. There were a number of things that were, and still are, marketed as nard that weren't really nard. The true spikenard grows only in the Himalayan mountains. And the ointment, this oil of spikenard, is the essential oil from little flowers that look like the flowers on honeysuckle. You can imagine, firstly, the labor to get enough oil out of that. And secondly, it's got to come all the way from the Himalayan mountains. Of course, it's incredibly valuable. And yet, it's mentioned often in the Old Testament. It was the ointment of all ointments. And the whole business about, I love this part, box. once again, they kind of blew it. The word in Greek is alabastron, okay, which they translate as alabaster box. An alabastron is a shape of a jar. They, depending on where they came from, they developed first in Egypt, right, where they were made not by building up a jar out of pottery, but by actually cutting a jar, shaping it, and then cutting the inside out of alabaster, the stone. Very, very thin. And the shape of an alabastron is usually a bulbous bottom with a thin neck. And sometimes with little handles on the side, not always. They range in size from about this big to about this big. Right? They were, Pliny the Elder wrote the great naturalist, wrote, the best ointment is preserved in alabaster. What do you mean, preserved? I mean, in that they're used? Well, yes and no. Because these very expensive ointments were so expensive, and because they were small and portable, and it was a ready market for them, people bought them as investments. If you're going on a trip, you're going from Rome to Athens, you can't buy traveler's checks. This is one of the things you do. And particularly if you're going on a long journey, and particularly if you're going from a place where it's cheaper than where you're going to. The point is, this is very expensive stuff. Why did she break the box? Because it wasn't a box, it was an alabastron. And there were two different ways. You either had a stopper or a cork or something, but usually not. With the smaller ones, you broke it to get the ointment out. Or, the custom was when you arrived at, a dinner to which you had been invited, you would have your feet washed, and usually there would be a little dab of oil put on your head. Not to help you, it wasn't Brill cream, it wasn't to make your hair look neat. It was perfumed oil. That's what nard was. It was perfumed oil. And in the Luke story that parallels this one, Jesus said, I came here and you didn't offer me oil. I learned when we were in Turkey that it is a custom among the Turks that when you show up when a man shows up at another man's house, there is a table usually beside the door with various colognes on it. And you offer it, and he rubs it with his hands and he does. It's to freshen you up, the visitor. It's the same custom. Boy, it's lasted a long time.
How much is the 30 denarii? 300 denarii. How much would that be?
An enormous amount. In John's Gospel, it says that it specifies that this was a pound. Now, the Roman pound wasn't 16 ounces, it was 12.6. I looked up the price of nard. No, really, I did. You can still buy the ointment. And that amount today would cost about $600.
Just the nard itself.
Well, the ointment.
Okay.
It's always mixed in, but with oil. That's what makes it an ointment. But probably a great deal more than that would be an appropriate modern valuation, because remember, a denarius was a day's wage for a laboring man.
So this is a year's pay.
Yeah, exactly. This is a very, very, that's what I was trying to point it out. Yeah, thank you. that this is a very shockingly wasteful, if you want to put it that way, thing.
You were talking about rubbing oil on the forehead. Is that what's carried over in our sacraments today?
No. And stood at his feet behind him weeping, began to wash his feet with tears, did wipe them with, sorry, I'm back in Luke again, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Uh,
You just get into the muttering
okay,
right
he
now.
poured
The
oil on
indignation.
his head. And there were some that had indignation within themselves and said, why was this waste of the ointment made? For it might have been sold for more than 300 pence. That would be 300 denarii, so that would be a year's wage, all those. And had been given to the poor, and they murmured against her. Jesus says, leave her alone. Why trouble you her? She has brought a good work on me. The poor you have with you always, whensoever you may do them good, but me ye have not always. She hath done what she could. She has come aforehand to anoint my body to the burying. There were three things that were ritually anointed at this time. One was monarchs, and sometimes priests, pagan priests were anointed. That is, oil, it wasn't just a mark, it was oil either poured on the head, usually poured on the head. Sacrifices were anointed, both Jewish and some Jewish and some pagan sacrifices. The rituals that we know call for pouring oil on the sacrifice and the dead. The dead were anointed with, the body's clean, then it's anointed with oil, then it's wrapped up. And for the Jews, then it was put away. Either put it in the ground or in a tomb above ground. There are two other anointing stories in the Gospels, and they don't exactly agree. In Luke, the one that I kept trying to get into ahead of time, it said, this is in Luke 7, so it's early. One of the Pharisees desired him, Jesus, that he would eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box, stood at his feet weeping. That's what I was reading you before. And then, in John 12, it says 6 days before the Passover, not 2, but 6. Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, which had been dead, whom he had raised. There they made him a supper. And Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with a hair, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. I'm not sure whether, some of this is garbled, whether there's change, whether there's three different things, because they're different they're certainly different in some respects, I would say important respects. But I just thought I should point out that there are three separate anointing stories, which, whether it happened 3 times or only happened once and was recorded 3 times, either way would indicate that it was an important event, that it's something that the 3 Gospelers wanted, remembered. So there's that. Okay. The house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Okay. And there was some that had indignation within themselves and said, why was this waste of the ointment made? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and have been given to the poor, and they murmured against it. This is a perennial, okay? It comes up over and over and over again. Why doesn't the church sell everything it owns and give it to the poor? It's so easy to say that. Because the poor you will always have with you. And yes, we are called upon to be charitable. But what would be what I think, I'm looking forward to getting back overseas again, I think that some of the magnificent cultural treasures of Christendom in particular have probably done an enormous lot more spiritual good than we could ever do physical good. And I would hate to see the Vatican Museum emptied out in order to provide social services for a short time, because it would always be a short time, and lose their heritage forever. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she hath done shall be spoken of for a memorial of her.
Mm-hmm.
And so here we are talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went unto the chief priest. Is this a final straw triggering act? Final straw triggering act?
The juxtaposition implies that.
Yeah. And in some of the other, one of the other gospels says that he said that attributes the statement, why was this waste? It might have been sold and so forth. Attributes that to Judas, saying, and he said this not because he cared for the poor, but because he kept the money box.
Mm-hmm.
In any event, maybe it is. Maybe this is some sort of final straw for
Well,
Judas.
He's
We don't
already
really know.
set it up with the officials, hasn't he?
Pardon me?
Hasn't he already set it
No,
up
ma'am,
with the
not at this point.
No.
This is when he decides to go and do it. And
Maybe.
Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went unto the chief priests to betray him unto them.
No, I
And
know
when
he
they
did.
heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought how he might conveniently betray him. One wonders, it's just, Judas, is Judas really, is he, to me it seems too easy to say, well, he's a crook and he wants to have lots of money in the box so he can pinch some. But I also wonder if it wasn't a matter of Jesus talking about dying, it's time to get off the sinking ship, or whether it's, what's the word I'm looking for? Whether
Force
it's
God's hand.
Ma'am?
He wants to force his hand, possibly.
I've heard that, the idea that he wants to force Jesus to be condemned. He wants to see Jesus condemned so that Jesus will call upon the armies of angels to come and save him, and that'll be the end.
Dorothy Sayers uses that in her A Man Born to Be King.
No, Man Born to Die.
Oh, okay.
Isn't it?
I thought it was Man.
Maybe it is. Maybe it is Man Born to Die.
No.
The radio play.
Yes,
You're
the
probably,
radio play.
you're
I
probably
think she
right. Your
uses
memory's
that.
better than mine.
Yeah.
Or possibly it's a matter of, boy, Jesus has really gone over the deep end now. We don't know. And all of it, what I do know is about 5 minutes to 9.
But verse 8 is very telling, isn't it?
Which one is that?
Where she has done what she could. She's anointed my body beforehand for its burial.
Yeah, she has done what she could.
Is that in the other versions?
I believe so. All the versions, I think, include anointing. I didn't really memorize them. I'm sorry. I should have. I have difficulty dealing with any scripture in isolation from the rest of Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And they all have their own. They all have their own special milieux. They all have cultural background and all the rest, context that I've talked about. But at the same time, it's Scripture, and the church has treated it as self-referential for a long time. And obviously, it's right there. I mean, Jesus saying, "Yeah, you heard me. You know what Daniel said, don't you?" I mean, he's using it, and so should we. So, and it's difficult not to make those comparisons and to see what the different points being made by the different authors are. So, thank you all very much. I will not be here again until, what was the date?
12 June.
12 June. Meredith's birthday. It's my middle son, our middle son. Okay, so we will meet again on 12 June. Probably 2-3 more sessions, I would guess. I don't know. We're getting very close to the end here, and you know how quick Mark likes to move. This chapter 14, chapter 13, 14, with that long discourse, that's very unusual in Mark, as you have noticed. It's usually when he doesn't always use direct quotations. Sometimes he just says what Jesus says, but when he does use direct quotations, they're almost always pretty short. But here, he's really spread himself, which is unusual. In any event, I will look forward to getting back. I lie charmingly, don't I? But I really am looking forward to getting over to Greece. I have some things I want to see. So we'll see how they go. Madam, how was the recital?
Fine.
Laurel, do okay?
She did just great.
Okay, good.
Bring him back safe to us so we can find out how.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do my best. Well, not only that, but so you can paint some more beautiful paintings. Not only that, but so you can paint some more beautiful paintings.
I'm excited for you that you can
Oh,
go to
that's
Greece.
good too.
That's terrific. I've never been to Greece. I can't wait to go someday.
Judas really wanted Jesus to